Hello, and welcome to this virtual event, End Gender Apartheid, utilizing international law to support women's rights in Afghanistan. This program is being co-hosted by the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project and the End Gender Apartheid campaign. I'm Melanne Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Our work includes the Onward for Afghan Women initiative that is focused on supporting Afghan women leaders in exile as they continue their advocacy on behalf of women's rights in Afghanistan today. In the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, today marks the first day of Women's History Month. And next week, the world marks International Women's Day. This is an especially appropriate time to reflect on the continuing journey for gender equality around the world. In the past 2 decades, women and girls in Afghanistan had made tremendous strides to build a better future for themselves and the next generation of Afghan women leaders. Sadly, since the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, they have ruthlessly undertaken systematic and unprecedented efforts to erase women's rights and regulate literally every facet of women's lives in every sphere of activity, issuing over 100 draconian decrees. They've denied women and girls their fundamental right to an education and professional and economic opportunities, removed women leaders from government, business, and the nonprofit sectors, banned women from public spaces like parks and restaurants, imposed a severe dress code strictly enforced by the Vice and Virtue Ministry, enacted male chaperone requirements, and they've cracked down on protests against these abhorrent policies. Today, an Afghan woman is dying every 2 hours in childbirth. This systematic oppression of women and girls is nothing less than gender apartheid and constitutes the foundation of the Taliban rule. Today's program will lay out the compelling case for codifying gender apartheid under international law and its unique ability to promote accountability and prevent further abuse. We are joined by almost 600 participants on Zoom, and we are pleased that among them are representatives of the United States government, other foreign governments, international organizations, including many UN agencies, as well as the media. Many of you have already submitted questions, which we will put to our distinguished panel of experts once we have heard from them. And you may continue to submit questions throughout this program. We will turn now to the Honorable Richard Bennett, who serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. In this role, he has conducted and prepared reports to the UN Human Rights Council on the situation of Afghan women and girls. Richard, thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to your opening remarks, setting the context for this discussion. Welcome.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Ambassador Verveer. And it's an honor to join this incredibly important program this morning. I hope you can hear me clearly, because I've just noticed in the last few minutes that I'm on an insecure internet connection. I'm speaking to you from the UN in Geneva. And hopefully it will keep going. But do let me know if there are...
We can hear you well. Please proceed.
Good. That's good. Thank you. I presented my latest report on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan to the Human Rights Council here yesterday. And in the report, I provided an overview of the situation of women and girls, but also of the broader human rights situation, covering, for example, minority groups, children, human rights defenders, civil society, and other minorities, including people with disabilities and LGBTIQ people. My headline of my press release is UN expert calls on the international community to prioritize human rights of Afghans in any normalization. And my strong message to the international community was not to even consider normalization or recognition of a country where half the population is erased from public life. Since this conference is focusing on women and girls' rights in the context of, I think, upcoming discussions in New York regarding the potential treaty on crimes against humanity, I'll share with my report. I said that the de facto authorities have created a system in which the discrimination, segregation, oppression, and exclusion of women and girls are institutionalized. And I said to the Human Rights Council that this situation amounts to persecution based on gender, which is a crime against humanity. I also said that the de facto authorities appear to be governing by systematic discrimination with the intention to subject women and girls to total domination, which may merit characterizing the situation as gender apartheid. I'd like to let you know that I've been tasked by the Human Rights Council to present a further report in June, building on a report that I made jointly with the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls last June, to expand on this issue. And my team has already started to prepare a series of consultations with Afghan women and girls to better understand what the concepts of justice and accountability mean to them, and what practical, effective steps the international community could take to improve their situation. I'll also be asking them about how the use of the term gender apartheid, for gender apartheid, and for whom is this term most meaningful? How can we use the codification to serve broader objectives of genuine gender equality and the lifting of all measures that restrict women's rights? I have already issued a call for submissions. So I'm delighted there's such interest and such a significant audience today. And I'd invite anyone who wishes to contribute to my report to share their views. They may visit my website. You just go into Richard Bennett or Special Rapporteur, Afghanistan, and you'll find it. And look at the questions we've identified. I am not sure whether we can post them in the chat, but we will post this in the chat as well. And we'll also post my report and my press release from yesterday. For example, in the context we're discussing, my report discusses the harsh enforcement of the Taliban's dress code since early January, including the arbitrary and at times violent deprivation of liberty of women and girls who did not comply or perceived to not to comply within the gendered roles that the Taliban has assigned for them in society. But how are these emblematic of these incidents emblematic of institutionalized system of oppression. Beyond the fact that arrests on supposed dress code violations clearly infringe women and girls' right to privacy and self-expression, we found that the detained women and girls could only be released after a male family member had signed written guarantees that their female relatives would adhere to the prescribed dress code in the future. And that is an example of how we see discrimination being institutionalized and agency being removed. I'm in favor of an all tools approach to addressing the catastrophe that is the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan today. There are tools that are currently being deployed already. Gender persecution is already a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute. And we are aware that the investigations by the prosecutor of the ICC are in full swing. We also think that there are other opportunities. For example, through the use of the International Court of Justice, ICJ. And I will, since there are also some member states joining today, I'll remind you that states parties to CEDAW possess the authority to initiate a case against Afghanistan at the ICJ for non-compliance with the convention. And I'll also note that at the beginning of last week, the CEDAW committee issued a statement which included, quote, the prevailing systematic gender-based discrimination by the Taliban violates almost all the substantive articles of this convention. Perhaps this could be an interesting entry point. I'll round up perhaps by saying that states and all other stakeholders must also tackle these key questions with a sense of realism and a commitment to international human rights law, while giving the highest priority to the human rights of Afghan citizens. And as I started, I'll end. There should be no normalization or legitimization of the Taliban until there are demonstrated, measurable, independently verified, significant improvements in the respect for human rights as defined in international law, in particular, the rights of women and girls. Human rights are sometimes seen in this politicized environment as something of a spoiler for other processes. They are not. Human rights are the cornerstone for any possibility of durable peace in Afghanistan. They must be a core part of any political track that is being contemplated. Thank you very much, Ambassador Vivier.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for those cogent remarks, for reminding us about the persecution based on gender that is taking place in Afghanistan today, and how this discussion really has to be core. Human rights have to be core to anything that continues to be discussed and dealt with respect to Afghanistan. And we're going to go on now to discuss some of the legal tools to end these horrible restrictions, this gender apartheid. And we thank you for setting the stage for our conversation. So thanks for being with us, and we will now proceed with our distinguished panel. I'm going to begin with Shaharzad Akbar, known to many of you, the former chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. She is currently the director of Rawadari, an Afghan human rights organization. Her work is focused on supporting Afghan civil society, media, strengthening grassroots human rights mechanisms. And she has engaged with the UN on numerous occasions, including appearing before the Security Council. She is coming to us today from Oxford, England, where she is a visiting scholar, having been forced into exile. Shaharzad, it's always so good to have you with us. And I know that your remarks will add greatly to our discussion and its importance. You have such deep experience in the area of human rights. Your organization has published several reports on documenting what the Taliban are doing to erode human rights across the board in Afghanistan. And I wonder if you could discuss what is happening under the Taliban today and what you are hearing from inside the country, because we know the world is not as focused as it needs to be on what is continuing to happen there. So please.
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you, the organizers, for giving me this opportunity. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and it's great to hear from Richard fresh off the Human Rights Council session and hear more about his excellent report. Well, we in Rawadari have been documenting the human rights situation in Afghanistan since September 2021, even before we start our public work. We are seeing a few trends. One of the key trends is access to information has become continuously worse. It's much harder to verify incidents. It means that Taliban are not only violating human rights on a large scale, but also trying to hide these violations. They are very open and they are very unashamed with violations of women's human rights. But when it comes, for instance, to some of the violations of the rights of ethnic minorities, the violations issues of torture, extrajudicial killings, the fact that there is no actual amnesty on the grounds, they are trying to suppress information, access to information. So they are making it very difficult to verify information. So what you know about violations, what we all know is just the tip of the iceberg. Also with women's rights, particularly, issues around torture, detention, torture and detention, illegal detention, enforced disappearances, sexual abuse. These are the issues where it's very hard to, we know these cases exist, it's very hard to verify information also because of stigma and because of the general conditions on the ground. Victims and survivors are threatened by the Taliban. Detainees have to sign papers before release, and communities have to give guarantees that they will not speak about their experience in detention. People are actively silenced. There are phone calls, there are visits, there are threats. As I said, there are like short-term and long-term detentions. So that's one trend that has continuously gotten worse. The other thing that we see on the ground is, of course, the worsening situation for women and girls, as you spoke about it, Ambassador, as well as Richard, that we just completed our 2023 human rights report. It's completely shattering. Just looking at the extent of limitations and the brutal enforcement of them. We looked at some data, at some stories, and with victim testimonies between March 8 last year and now we are on the eve of 8 March, Universal Women's Day. And Taliban have gone after women for putting henna on their hands. Taliban are banning women from visiting shrines, things that are so intrinsic to Afghan culture. And sometimes people think that Taliban are only the enemy of educated women or women in the cities. It's across the board, all over Afghanistan. Taliban are trying to completely disappear women from the public space. There are limits on families going to the restaurants. There are bans on, women, healthcare workers are being replaced by male healthcare workers. It's relentless. It's every day. It's and it's a pattern. And you see, initially you had the intelligence unit being the most forceful and brutal. Now you see more and more Ministry of so-called promotion of virtue and prevention of voice, doing that policing role, as well as provincial ulama councils. Now, Taliban have replaced these councils for religious scholars in provinces. They have replaced the ulama that were there traditionally with ulama that are loyal to them. And in mostly, even in mostly Shia-dominated provinces, they have appointed Sunni ulama to these provincial councils. And these provincial councils are acting like spies for the Taliban, but also are getting engaged in decision-making and even sometimes aid distribution. And they bring another layer of misogyny and another another actor, another perpetrator in this gender persecution. So there are multiple layers, multiple institutions now. There's increased enforcement. At the same time, of course, Afghan women have been fighting since day one. Afghan women went to the streets on August 16, Kabul fell to Taliban on August 15. They have continuously changed their tactics in face of the brutal oppression of Taliban, and people have had to leave to save their lives. But the struggle hasn't stopped. And I think that's very important. That's where the discussion of accountability measures come in, because there is growing sense, when I talk to women and girls in Afghanistan, there's growing sense of loneliness. There's growing unfortunate acceptance of the fact that this is now our fate. The world has made peace with it. Everyone is normalizing the Taliban, which is why we need the global feminist movement of solidarity with Afghan women and girls. Really, that movement was needed 2.5 years ago. We need a consistent movement, consistent in the way that Taliban are consistent in their brutality. We need to be consistent in our solidarity with women and girls in Afghanistan. And we need accountability measures. I see many diplomats talking about accountability measures with a lot of hesitance because they want to engage for humanitarian purposes. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is awful. It must change. We need more humanitarian assistance. We also need more ways to get more money to Afghanistan without it going to the Taliban and creating economic opportunities. I don't have a doubt about it for a minute, but there is this false dichotomy that by engaging, you shouldn't hold people accountable. If it's an engagement without accountability, it's not engagement, it's appeasement. So stop appeasement, engage in the principal matter, and also hold Taliban accountable. Remember what Taliban were doing when the so-called peace talks were going on. They were fighting and talking, right? They didn't stop talking and they didn't stop fighting. You are engaging, but you're not holding them accountable under international law, peacefully holding them accountable through these mechanisms that exist exactly for this purpose. So that's what I would end with. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Your voice has been so meaningful for so long now, Shaharzad, and you've just demonstrated once again how important it is to hear you. We can't make peace with what the Taliban is doing in oppressing women there in Afghanistan. And your plea for engagement with accountability, something that we have to keep in mind, because in many ways it's the basis for this discussion. I'm going to turn now to Professor Hannah Garry, who is the Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA's School of Law. She's an expert on international law, focusing on transitional justice, the international courts and tribunals, human rights and refugee law. She's often invited as an expert before the ICC, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and many other important bodies. Hannah, thank you too for being with us and for getting up so early, because you're on the West Coast as we're having this discussion. You have worked extensively with the international courts and organizations to advance human rights, including most recently as a participant in the UK-led gender apartheid inquiry that has just taken place. What legal tools exist to promote accountability for violations of Afghan women's rights, the accountability that Shaharzad just expressed as so critically important? And what is the role and legal basis for any new tools, like, for example, gender apartheid framework that we're also discussing today?
Well, good morning, Ambassador and everyone. And I just want to thank you so much for that kind introduction and for your critical question. in light of the intensity and the gravity of the violations by the Taliban that continue against women and girls in Afghanistan today, as Shaharzad just so compellingly outlined. The need for prevention, accountability, and refusal to normalize the Taliban, whose conduct rises to the level of international crimes, is urgent now more than ever. I can't emphasize that enough. And I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this discussion with this distinguished panel. And in addressing your question, I'm going to focus my remarks specifically with relation to my background in international criminal law over 20 years on the official investigation into the situation in Afghanistan by the prosecutor that was referenced by the Special Rapporteur, and how we can and must use it as an important accountability tool. And following that, I'll close with a few recommendations for states and civil society, including current entry points for codification of gender apartheid as an international legal norm. So first, the ICC's official investigation. And by way of background, for reasons we don't have time to go into this today, the ICC prosecutor began his preliminary investigation into Afghanistan quite a while ago in 2006. However, the official investigation didn't really get underway until just over a year ago in October 2022. And when resuming that official investigation, Prosecutor Karim Khan made clear that he would prioritize his limited resources to focus on crimes committed by the Taliban, specifically persecution of women and girls, in light of their gravity, scale, and ongoing nature. And as such, this is really an opportune moment for leveraging this important avenue for accountability. What this stage of the process means is that the prosecutor has already brought forward sufficient evidence before a court of law establishing a reasonable basis that grave human rights abuses perpetrated against women and girls by the Taliban amount to international crimes, full stop. ICC judges have confirmed the analysis, and as such, these acts now require investigation, prosecution, and punishment of convicted persons, whether by the ICC itself or any national system that might have jurisdiction and ability to do so. Presently, the prosecutor's office is conducting that investigation into alleged crimes, collecting evidence in order to establish that they are being perpetrated under the higher standard of burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt that is required for conviction. And civil society, together with Afghan women, human rights defenders, and states, can supplement these OTP investigations. And the Taliban should be on notice that their past, present, and future abuses against Afghan women and girls are under scrutiny, and at any time the prosecutor could bring charges and request ICC judges to issue summons to appear or arrest warrants against those believed to be most responsible for the abuses, no matter who the perpetrator or their official status. If the judges do so, all of the 124 states parties to the Rome Statute have a legal obligation to cooperate with the court and surrender any such individual to stand trial. Now, in terms of building the case, it's clear that the ongoing grave violations of the rights of women and girls by the Taliban fall squarely within the investigation's scope, both factually and legally. And first, with regard to the facts, as other panelists have already highlighted, since the Taliban returned to power in August 2021, after US and NATO withdrawal, they and their affiliates have systematically reversed 2 decades of progress for women and girls, just as they did in the 1990s. This includes imposing segregation of women and men, excluding women and girls from public spaces and spheres, and through institutionalized law and policy, the Taliban are depriving women and girls of freedom of movement, access to healthcare, access to justice, the rights to participate in government, to education past age 12, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom from violence, and much more. As one woman has described it, quote unquote, "We are being erased." And according to the United Nations, suicides by women and girls are increasing at an alarming rate. Just to give you a sense of scale, the current population of Afghanistan is estimated at just over 39 million people, with around 47% or over 18 million being impacted women and girls. Now, second, as for the investigation's legal scope, the prosecutor is looking into alleged crimes committed on Afghan territory since 1st of May 2003, when Afghanistan became a state's party, as it's allowed to do under the court's territorial and temporal jurisdiction. And as such, the severe deprivation of women and girls' rights after August 2021 falls squarely within that jurisdiction since the Taliban came to power a second time. However, unfortunately, the similar treatment by the Taliban that we saw prior in the 1990s does not fall in that jurisdiction. However, that history could be useful for proving certain aspects of the current criminal acts as well as the mens rea or criminal intent. Now, regarding alleged crimes or subject matter jurisdiction, the prosecutor is investigating crimes against humanity and not war crimes, and that makes sense because the underlying inhumane acts do not clearly have a nexus here to an armed conflict necessary for war crimes. However, necessary for crimes against humanity, it is clear that the Taliban has been engaged in an attack consisting of both widespread commission of multiplicity of inhumane acts directed against women and girls as a significant part of Afghanistan's civilian population, and systematic attacks conducted in furtherance of a state or organizational plan or policy to impose Taliban rule, policies, and beliefs by law and lethal force. Since crimes against humanity also require proof of underlying acts that are perpetrated as part of the overarching attack, the prosecutor has predictably indicated it is investigating persecution with discriminatory animus against an identifiable group on gender grounds under Article 7 of the Rome Statute. And charges of persecution require that those acts are also connected to other international crimes in the Rome Statute, such as inhumane acts enumerated under Article 7 of the statute. And sadly, in the case of Afghan women and girls, that is not difficult to do. You could potentially charge as well murder, enslavement, imprisonment, torture, rape, other acts of sexual violence, and other inhumane acts of similar character, intentionally causing great suffering and serious injury to mental or physical health. These other underlying acts, along with persecution, may and should be brought as discrete cumulative charges in and of themselves, and doing so will demonstrate the full scale and gravity of what Afghan women and girls are suffering and lead to more complete accountability for the Taliban's oppression. Finally, with regard to gender apartheid, while it is not yet a norm that is codified in the Rome Statute and therefore cannot be charged by the OTP, there are several ways in which the gender apartheid analysis should be used by the prosecutor. First, for more accurately framing the facts of the current situation as one of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination of women and girls. Second, for establishing the contextual elements for crimes against humanity that I've already outlined. And finally, for fully capturing the gravity of the situation as an admissibility requirement under the statute. Now, what I mean by gender apartheid is referring to a proposed amendment of the Rome Statute's definition of racial apartheid as a crime against humanity, already found in Article 7(1)(j) of the Rome Statute, which drew from the 1973 Apartheid Convention's definition. And this includes inhumane acts that are committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups. And it would be amended to include one gender group over another gender group or groups, committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. It is important to note that amending the definition of apartheid to include gender groups is endorsed by leaders that were part of the movement to dismantle racial apartheid in South Africa. And importantly, Afghan women human rights defenders are at the forefront of using this norm in their own language for years to describe the Taliban's criminal conduct. And as such, it's important that we, as an international community, from a transitional justice perspective, urge the prosecutor at the ICC to use that norm when he's bringing charges before the court, even if it's not yet codified, to fully capture the suffering to which they have been subjected. Finally, in closing, I'd like to suggest several recommendations for concrete next steps for civil society and states to engage in facilitating accountability through the ICC investigation, while also advocating for codification of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity under international law. First of all, CSOs and states can come alongside Afghan women human rights defenders in exile and civil society groups for submitting Article 15 submissions, presenting information to the prosecutor that establishes crimes against humanity, including the gender apartheid analysis, as I outlined. States should also provide resources for the prosecutor's already overstretched and taxed office in the face of ongoing conflicts elsewhere, and encourage the prosecutor to use this norm to join the chorus of experts, such as Special Rapporteur Bennett, in accurately describing the situation. Second, CSOs can advocate for ICC states parties to amend Article 7 of the statute to include gender groups in the definition of apartheid against a crime against humanity. Third, CSOs can lobby states generally to join the 6 countries including Australia, Malta, Mexico, Brazil, the United States, and Afghanistan, in supporting the inclusion of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity in a new Crimes Against Humanity treaty that is currently in process before discussions before the Sixth Committee, as well as the UNGA in this coming year. Such a treaty would have broader jurisdictional reach than the Rome Statute and would help close the impunity gap with a focus on national prosecutions. And finally, borrowing a suggestion from my colleague, Professor Karima Benoun at University of Michigan, CSOs can work with states to adopt a declaration on the crime against humanity of gender apartheid that would add to the growing evidence of crystallization of this norm under customary international law, with increased opinio juris from states, international organizations, and experts referring to it as a crime against humanity. And this includes the CEDAW committee most recently and the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls that are accurately using it to call for accountability and to describe the ongoing Taliban abuse by the Taliban of Afghan women and girls. With that, I'll close, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you so much, because you have given us much to think about. And I think certainly, as you said, accountability measures are needed today more than ever, but laying out the case of what is occurring, the legal background, the legal frameworks that are in place, and then especially at the end, the discussion that you just provided on telling us, explaining the gender apartheid framework and also recommendations for future steps. You've packed a wallop in what you said. I know you have to leave us now, but we're very, very grateful to you, and you've given us much to reflect on and continue to discuss. So thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you, Ambassador.
We're going to turn now to Metra Mehran, an Afghan human rights activist who serves as advisor to the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project. She's earned international recognition for her fierce advocacy on behalf of Afghan women and girls, featured in many media outlets, and has a long CV of actions that she's undertaken and testimony that she has provided. So Metra, it's so good to have you with us as well, because we're very interested in the perspective that you bring to this discussion. You've been a participant in Afghan engagements like the recent UN-led Doha meeting that just took place not too long ago. And I'm wondering, in these kinds of international forums in which you've participated, how have women's rights and gender apartheid experienced by Afghan women been discussed in these discussions? What has been happening? Has the envelope been pushed forward, or is it as though none of this really exists, as serious as it is?
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for today's event and having me here. Let's start by saying that as we convene on the inaugural Day of Women's History Month today, March 1st, an occasion that we're supposed to acknowledge and pay tribute to remarkable achievements of women, the current situation in Afghanistan stands as a setback for all of us. I feel it's like it's undermining the hard-fought battles of generations of women around the world for gender justice. We are now in Afghanistan, women's personhood is stripped away, and they are basically reduced to second-class citizens. However, as we are approaching the one-year anniversary of the End Gender Apartheid campaign, which many of you are signatory, I see a lot of prominence, and we see the momentum around gender apartheid and also other legal mechanisms for criminalizing and keeping Taliban actions and atrocities accountable, not as much as we see, but as we are almost on the second anniversary of this campaign, it gives me some hope. So let's start. I want to start with that spirit. I was one of the participants to Doha, where 25 countries and some other organizations were present there too, based on Security Council's Resolution 2679 that asked for that for the independent assessment. And the assessment proposed to has a bigger contact group to talk about the special representative for Afghanistan, and also that the special representative be responsible for a roadmap that can respond to the crisis in Afghanistan. I was there with everything happening around the world in the crisis and the conflicts. For me, that was a positive move forward that stakeholders convened and said to see what we can do about Afghanistan. Maybe it's very premature at this point to say what we expect from the process. The process that was discussed there. But I think what is important for us is, and what is very clear is we need a lot of work at civil society and think tanks in academia, and even politicians and legal experts and gender experts, that the process should be fair for the women of Afghanistan. And it also should consider the accountability mechanisms that as a civil society member we were pushing there. But honestly, it needs a lot of work. The momentum that needed to be in the room for the legal accountability mechanisms was not present. And I hope that we, if in the future convenings, Richard be there and her report and his reports be considered on that process. On international engagements, I think it depends where we are and who we talk to. When we talk about the situation in Afghanistan. But what is true is, and I think I should say that, is there is a unanimous agreement, at least on the situation of women and human rights in Afghanistan, that is not right. Maybe my understanding was maybe there are disagreements among countries how they want to take forward the process. And then how they want to negotiate who want to do what, or who the special representative for Afghanistan appointed by the who be, or how the roadmap will look like. But I think everyone knows that what's happening in Afghanistan in the crisis, human rights crisis, is not something that can be overlooked. Everyone agrees that is wrong and that should be addressed, both I think regional and international actors in case of Afghanistan. But I think it do need a lot of work. It does need a lot of advocacy going forward to ensure that the accountability mechanisms, legal ones, are considered in the process. And it shouldn't be seen only as a political issue or cultural issue that can be addressed. That's why I think codification of gender apartheid is key, and it's very important, because what's happening in Afghanistan, as Richard put it very well in Shaharzad, is not just mere actions, but they are the systematic and institutionalized act coming from the Taliban. Since they took power, they have issued around 134 or 35 decrees. 95 of them directly attack women's rights and introduce control mechanisms. And that is not only just decrees, there are enforcement policies like the Ministry of Vice and Virtue that barbarically enforce those on women. In the last few weeks, we see how women are taken from streets, not maybe even using arbitrary arrest word is not even correct at this point, as they just kidnap women when they are out for groceries or when they are out for accessing medical centers, because they are not out for anything else. They cannot go to work, they cannot go to school, they cannot do anything. But once they are out just to get groceries, something that they need to survive, they're just taken from the streets for violating any of the decrees, and that decision is made on that point without any due process by one of their morality police or the soldiers of the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. If he thinks her dressing is not appropriate, they put them in a car, take them to the prison, and as Shaharzad said, there is no due process, and then their families has to give guarantee for them to be released. And in that process, they are pulling the male members of the family and men in that society to be part of implementation of their draconian rules. So everything is so institutionalized now, and it getting worse, that without seeing them for what it is, in this case that we call it gender apartheid, nothing else can encompass that context. Maybe gender persecution is important, that we should go forward with ICC and other issues, but they address elements of certain crimes, not the context that's happening in Afghanistan, that I think it's not just pragmatically, but ideologically is existential for the Taliban's regime. That's the misogyny, or how they see women as less of a human, is the ideology that pushed their, that movement of the Taliban as a proxy or as a militia or as a terrorist group forward. So I think that's why it's important in any international engagement when we are there, we should talk about accountability and legal accountability, but also say why gender apartheid, I think as Professor Hanna mentioned it too, can encompass the intention of perpetuating this inhuman acts, and also how that is happening in that context, and how that is existential for the sustainability of the Taliban's regime. I stop, but before that, I think it is important for me to also mention that when we are talking about the legal accountability for the Taliban, that we should also talk about the accountability international community has towards their obligations. Normalization is not the process, and we have seen the appeasement to the Taliban is not working, and it's just making the situation worse and worse for the women and people of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, in their engagements, we also fail to see observing those obligations by other countries on how they approach Afghanistan. So I think another factor that makes gender apartheid important and makes also our work as a civil society activist harder is it brings a state responsibility for other states that we can keep them accountable towards that often with maybe some other laws we cannot. Echoing what Richard said, and I conclude with that, is when we talk about gender apartheid and gender persecution, we shouldn't see them as mutually exclusive. I think we need all of them together to go forward. And for the case of Afghanistan, yes, gender apartheid encompassed that context and the severity of the atrocities Taliban are doing against people of Afghanistan. But I think we need all these legal elements to keep the Taliban accountable and the atrocities they are committing against people of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Metra, for those compelling points. And I think advancing the discussion now to include not only a better understanding of what's happening in the larger international discussions, but how critical advocacy is in that regard. And as you underscored, utilizing all the tools that are available, but particularly why it's important to add gender apartheid to that list of mechanisms that should be seized to deal with this. So we will shortly turn to our audience questions, but I think, again, you have added greatly to our understanding of what's at stake here. We're going to round out our panel with Alyssa Yamamoto. She's a legal and policy advisor to the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project. Her focus is prevention and accountability for atrocity crimes, human rights violations, terrorism, and corruption offenses. She too has been very active in work of the international community, and particularly an international law firm and development-focused nonprofits. So Alyssa, you have gained insight into the role of UN member states through your previous work with the UN human rights treaty bodies and special procedures. So you bring that background to this discussion as well. What is the role of the UN member states now in advancing efforts to end gender apartheid by utilizing international law, particularly ahead of the 6th committee meeting that's going to take place next month. And maybe in the context of your response, you can also explain the role of the 6th committee and what this is about. And then we will round that out with your response and go on to the questions from the audience. So Alyssa, please.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you to Lena and the entire team at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security for organizing this really timely event. Before I dive in and answer your question, I do just want to echo the comments of my distinguished panelists in underscoring what I think is clearly the collective view of this panel. And that's when it comes to holding the Taliban regime to account for their ongoing and compounding attack on Afghan women, girls, and others in flagrant violation of international law, we really have to utilize all the diplomatic levers and legal tools at our disposal. That includes the legal pathways before the ICJ and the ICC, as Special Rapporteur Bennett and Hannah have flagged, and also at the same time, in parallel, the work underway to recalibrate and progress our legal frameworks to better reflect the lived experiences of victims and survivors and squarely respond to the Taliban's entrenchment of systematic oppression, domination, and subjugation. And this is the work of recognizing and codifying gender apartheid. And I want to say that's under both international and domestic laws. As Metra said, all of these justice avenues are complementary, mutually reinforcing, and I would argue equally pressing. They should be pursued in parallel, and they require urgent attention and coordinated action. And as a practical point, I do just want to echo Hannah's point earlier that the gender apartheid norm and framing can definitely be reinforced by both the ICC and the ICJ, even before the enumeration of the crime in the potential Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. So turning to your question on the role of UN member states, the international community has a really unique opportunity before it right now to expressly enumerate the crime of gender apartheid under international law. And one of the most politically expedient pathways for doing so that we've identified at the Atlantic Council and the Global Justice Center is through the draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention, which is before the UN General Assembly's legal committee. It's called the 6th Committee. If this convention moves forward to negotiation and adoption, and I should be clear, the text is not on the table yet. We're not even at that stage of negotiation. But should it move forward, it would mark the first major UN treaty on core international crimes since the 1998 Rome Statute of the ICC. And why is that important? It's because, as you can imagine, we've made significant strides in gender justice and the recognition of gendered crimes in the intervening 25 years since the Rome Statute. And we argue that our treaty law should reflect that. As Hannah explained, what we've proposed is expanding the existing definition of racial apartheid to rather encompass both race and gender grounds. And I would just want to underscore here that codifying new crimes, especially gendered ones, is by no means a new task or feat. If you look at the history of gendered crimes and their codification, we can look at the history of the crime of forced pregnancy. This was a crime that was enumerated in the Rome Statute, largely in response to the atrocities of what had unfolded in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And that was really led by a core number of states and the NGO Women's Caucus for Gender Justice. So I just want to say civil society here and the states present in this audience really can play a leading role in codifying what we are arguing now to be the crime of gender apartheid. And we have seen positive movement. So the UN Secretary General and multiple states have already used the term gender apartheid to describe what's unfolding in Afghanistan for women and girls. What we are trying to do now is move that term from a political, rhetorical, descriptive device to a legal, normative one with concrete legal consequences. And that's at the individual perpetrator level, but also, as Metra mentioned, at the state kind of regime level. And we are seeing that groundswell of support among the international community to make this a legal reality. And I will say, this is just as the international community coalesced and mobilized in response to the horrific realities of apartheid in Southern Africa. This is what we're calling for now, a similar coordinated global response of anti-gender apartheid. As many will recall, last fall, UN Women's Executive Director called for an intergovernmental process to explicitly codify gender apartheid under international law. Then in December, as Hannah mentioned, 6 member states referenced the potential inclusion of gender apartheid, specifically in the draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention. And I just flagged that these 6 states, it's a fairly diverse cross-regional grouping of states, which I really think is vital in pushing this agenda forward before the UN. And of course, throughout, there's been significant movement in socialization of the concept with member states, with thanks to UN special procedures, including Special Rapporteur Bennett and the human rights treaty bodies, including the CEDAW committee. So where do we go from here in member state engagement? I just want to flag 3 calls to action or concrete recommendations. The first is in advance of the April session of the 6th committee, which begins on April 1st, so time is limited. Please, we should all be pressuring member states through their New York and Geneva missions and also their capitals directly and asking them to voice support at the 6th committee session for including gender apartheid in the draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention. The goal here at this really early stage is for states to signpost their commitment early and often as we start effectively building a record on the proposed amendment and treaty. Moving this forward also requires, I think, all of us, a diverse group of stakeholders, putting broader pressure on member states to push this treaty forward to actual negotiations. So we have to do both of this kind of at the same time. My second call to action would be that we should really complement and reinforce the potential progressive development of international law by encouraging states to interrogate and tackle gender apartheid and build political buy-in for recognition in their domestic forums. So that includes through parliamentary inquiries like what we've seen in the UK, and also just through bilateral and regional meetings with foreign ministers and other gender experts. And my third call is really for civil society. I do think we need to ramp up our information sharing and coordination across the many incredible coalitions and networks that have been convened in recent years. I think from this panel alone and the audience present that I've seen running through the list of names, there's just such a diverse and impressive group of experts working on both fact-finding and the legal efforts to hold the Taliban to account. And I just hope we can work together to reinforce and strengthen what are frankly quite limited justice options at our disposal. So I'll end there, but I look forward to our discussion.
Well, that's really excellent, Alyssa, because the concrete recommendations that you just laid out are also coming through as questions from the audience that we're about to go into and underscore the desire on the part of so many to know precisely what more can be done and what each of us can do, frankly. So we're going to go to some of these questions now. If you want to, anyone who wants to answer them, just indicate and we'll call on you. But let me begin with a question from Kim Kleinhardt here. She asked, how is this related to all the gender-based conflicts throughout the world? How does codifying gender apartheid help women in other conflicts? And then I noticed on the chat, a question came in about Iran. So can you respond to that, and whoever wants to take it? Alyssa, you want to take that? I see you nodding affirmatively.
I'm happy to. And I may respond with kind of a frustrating, very legalistic answer, but you'll have to excuse me as I am a lawyer. I would just emphasize that what is being proposed for the definition of gender apartheid, like racial apartheid, involves a really high legal threshold. So we're talking about an inhumane act committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination, gender-based in this context, and the intent to maintain that regime. In addition, because it's a crime against humanity, it would be a crime that would have to meet those requirements as well, threshold requirements. So it would have to be committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population with knowledge of the attack. I would say this is intentional, that apartheid, what's happening in Afghanistan is kind of the most obvious, I would say, example of what meets this threshold. And to me, there's absolutely no doubt that it meets that threshold. I think there is some discussion and fact-finding and documentation and legal argumentation work that has to be done in other scenarios. But I do want to underscore, in the case of Iran, of course, there's been an incredible sisterhood of Iranian and Afghan women's rights defenders, jurists, and experts who have come together for this call for recognition. And so certainly would not want to ignore what, the entrenchment of norms and the new policies and laws that have been passed and adopted in the Iranian context.
Great. Well, I think you've well laid out the criteria that has to be met here. We have a number of questions having to do first with what the international community can do to better support and help women in Afghanistan from outside of Afghanistan, where we find ourselves. And also, coupled with that, what steps can we better take to advocate for the gender apartheid framework, how to convince the international community and the UN to recognize gender apartheid. And Roshan Mashal at the University of Texas, Arlington has asked that. Now, Alyssa, you've addressed a number of those steps already, but I'm wondering, probably Metra and Shaharzad, and coming in again, Alyssa, if we can look at both the situation of Afghan women, what more we can do in that case specifically. And this, of course, addresses it, but it's one aspect. And then perhaps maybe more concretely, what we can do on the issue of the gender apartheid. So anyone who wants to start on that, I think, given the number of questions I have here, there is tremendous interest in this. Shaharzad, please begin.
I'm happy to start. On the general question of how can we support Afghan women activists and just Afghan women generally inside Afghanistan, I think, well, pressure your states on accountability measures, but also it's very important that there is continued resettlement avenues available for Afghan human rights defenders, both women and men at risk. We have people in Pakistan and Iran in legal limbo, people who, if they are sent back, they will face torture or they will be killed by the Taliban. This is something that is entirely at the control of international community, Western states mainly. They don't have to wait for Taliban's permission to do this. It's appalling how little is being done now that attention has moved away, while still people remain at risk. I do understand that there is an argument for, there are kind of multiple arguments and risks associated to this, but I think this is something simple. It should be just on top of the agenda, remain on. It's about protection for activists, journalists, and other people who are at risk, former security personnel. It's widely documented that these people are at risk. The other thing is to continued support to Afghan civil society inside and outside Afghanistan. Support inside Afghanistan remains complicated, but that shouldn't deter international community. Financial support, political support. It's very important that we keep planting seeds inside the country, that we keep the light on, that we keep supporting educated men and women pursuing change. Traditional human rights work is very difficult inside Afghanistan, but if people are running literacy courses, book clubs, poetry readings, whatever they're doing to kind of come together and illustrate solidarity and stand against this mission of Taliban to further radicalize Afghanistan, those things in the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, those things need resources, and these resources need to be made available. And then I think it's relevant to the gender apartheid as well, is I think, I don't want to say I have given up on the governments, but there's a lot going on in the world, we all know, and the attentions of politicians and states keep moving. I don't see possibility of change in the short term, but I do see the possibility of change and lasting change in medium term if we can sustain a global movement of people power, grassroots organizations, of civil society, of women's groups, of universities in support of Afghan women and girls. So if there is something that you can do, even one event per year, one discussion, one book you can read about Afghanistan, one tweet you can send about the situation in Afghanistan, one news article you can promote, just keeping this flame burning is very, very important, and keep building power is very important, because governments want to look away. It's in their interest. They want us to be forgotten yesterday. So.
I think, Shaharzad, you put that very well, because with the attention moving away from Afghanistan by virtue of all the other things that are happening in the world, not to justify it at all, of course, the humanitarian crisis, and then the kinds of horrific restrictions that have been placed on women, we do need more. And I think that's some of the frustration you're hearing from the questions of the audience. Metra, do you want to add to that in either context?
Thank you so much. Echoing on what Shaharzad John said, I think it is very important that we ensure that we hear women of Afghanistan. Most of the time, I think everyone relies on others' analysis and judgments, but then they have been very vocal and loud on their demands, what they want from any processes, what they want from the type of government, what they want in terms of their rights, who they are, where they are, I think. And they have done that, accepting Talib's lashes and imprisonment and torture, getting on the street and saying that. So I think first thing is how we can recognize that and give legitimacy to those voices. What we noticed, another thing that we noticed in our international engagement that you raised before, is I think that political agency of women protesters as an opposition to the Taliban is not recognized. How we can push for that, or how we can create more narratives around that on our discussions, in our panel discussions, in our writings, and even in our remarks. So I think that is, we should see them for who they are and what they are doing. That's the first thing, and they are there clear and loud. We just need to hear them. The second thing is, even when we are talking about the accountability measurements, for example, ICC, they need resources. So it is important that the people, CSOs and states ensure that ICC or any other accountability measurements have enough resources that to take the cases forward. And third and last thing, one of the questions that I receive some days is like how they can help women of Afghanistan without putting them at risk. And then what we are saying is they are at risk. They are accepting risk to do certain things. The question is, do you stand by them and support them, or you are just, even if you're comfortable in this part of the world, just don't do that? So I am not saying that you just go and introduce a project that's your idea. They know how to navigate their way within that complex, hard situation and context the Taliban has created. I think as Shaharzad said, for example, they went to street first, but now they are adapting how to do online protests, how to do behind closed doors. I think they are adapting and navigating their way in that context. And that doesn't mean that the CSOs in Afghanistan, led by women, are operating, doing different activities, if not political actions or going to streets anymore. We need to support them first, and then I think ease some procedures on them, because I have been working with women protesters, mainly the ones that once they get out of the prison, they are tortured, they are sick, they need medical attention. If I file a form for them to get some money, it takes months, and then needs to go through several processes. And then they want the NGOs operating in Afghanistan be also obliged by the Minister of Economy, controlled by the Taliban. So I think we need to, a little CSOs working outside, want to coordinate and collaborate with CSOs or activists inside Afghanistan to ease some of these procedures is, I think, important. Just that solidarity and supporting, going their way, allow them to tell you how to navigate their path, I think is empowering enough to just keep those movements and voices alive inside Afghanistan.
I think those are really good points that you brought in, reflecting what's happening with women on the ground and how they've had to adjust, and how we too, in many ways, have to continue to be supportive in ways that relate to their situation. So thank you for that, Metra. Alyssa, did you want to add anything else in this round?
Sure. Maybe first, just to say at the most basic level, I completely agree with Shaharzad and Metra. Like, please stay informed, stay engaged. And I will say, actually, despite the shifting attention of the world to other conflicts and other priorities, I actually think that this is an interesting inflection point for us to think about international justice and accountability. And maybe just to be more candid, what is unfolding in Gaza? And for instance, South Africa's leadership before the International Court of Justice has really, I think, signaled and reaffirmed to us the importance of international accountability, of third state responsibility, and really the strength of the global majority. And I hope that we can kind of capitalize on that moment for the sake of Afghanistan and Afghan women and girls as well. The only other quick thing I would say is, in addition to engaging with any member state counterparts, whether at the kind of parliamentary or congressional level or kind of ministerial, please also continue to engage with the UN. So UN Women and UN Special Procedures, including Special Rapporteur Bennett and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. And I see Dorothy is among us in the audience here. They have taken such an important leadership role, but they need further support, I would argue, across the UN Secretariat and agencies. We really need to show that there's UN-wide buy-in in what we are pushing forward here, and show, if, at the very least, like, make sure the Secretary General and others don't interfere with what we are trying to push forward here. So please do continue to engage with any counterparts at that level.
Well, mentioning the UN, we have a number of questions with respect to the UN's actions on these issues. One has a question about the delay in the level of UN moving forward on gender apartheid. For example, you already explained the procedure and how much still has to come before there can be that kind of real engagement. And then other questions about the chances within the UN. Does anybody want to just expand on that a little bit more, since there's a lot of interest in the role of the UN? Well, Alyssa, I'm going to pass it back to you because you've already touched on this, and maybe you can enhance it a bit more.
Sure, and I guess I haven't had a chance to run through. There's been a lot of activity in the chat and the Q&A. So
I know it's hard
if it's
to keep
about
up
the UN. The UN proper, or about the member states?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both the institution and member states.
Understood. Okay. So on the UN at the institutional or IO level, the UN Secretary General has used the gender apartheid framing to describe what has unfolded in Afghanistan, actually quite early on in this broader international public dialogue. And as I flagged during my remarks, UN Women's Executive Director explicitly called for the codification of it as a crime. And then we have the wonderful work of Special Procedures continuing to push this forward. We haven't heard much more from OHCHR, for instance. They have used it again in the framing, but not in terms of the codification. So I think there's space there for OHCHR to speak up. It would be great if the Secretary General and his office also explicitly talked about the codification part. And all of this goes back to my comments before of what we're trying to do is move this from the political rhetorical space into the legal space. So anything we can do to kind of show broad support for that legal codification, I think, is really important. In terms of the member states component, I think we had flagged, the activity and progress so far. Time will tell, frankly, and we need everybody's, I think, support in pushing both at the General Assembly level within the 6th committee, but actually also at the 3rd committee, at kind of the more political dialogues around Afghanistan, at the Security Council, at Geneva with the Human Rights Council. Everything has to kind of move in parallel to build political pressure so that missions and states, frankly, feel that it is politically unwise for them not to join what is clearly kind of the bandwagon of support for gender apartheid, always driven by our Afghan partners and the kind of remarkable experts here on this panel.
Well, and again, underscoring just how important advocacy is across the board in these realms. I don't remember who it was in our panel who mentioned resources, but I remember that one of you did. And we have a question here about how can we finance the fight against gender apartheid? Where are opportunities to secure funding? This is from Natasha Garcha, who is the Director of Innovation, Finance, and Gender Lens Investing. Any comments on the need for resources and then how we might better do that? Metra?
I think, as Alyssa put it very well, is for the codification of gender apartheid, a lot of things need to go in parallel. So there is no single address that can be financed to push this fight forward. But of course, searching and seeing which organizations are fighting for it, which is important legally. The organization do need resources, to take forward this fight at the UN level in New York. But at the same time, the socialization of this ideology, this idea, mobilization of efforts around it, is very important. That I think everyone, at least in this room, is doing. Shaharzad is producing reports for it, so Richard Bennett, and then and many other, and the voices of women protesters in Afghanistan have been very bold and key in giving a momentum for this fight. So I think anything around Afghanistan and women's rights issues and human rights issues, but who are talking how it's systematic and institutionalized, those who are producing reports, those who are going through the legal processes, is important. So I cannot say there is one single or two single address that we can support, but I think this fight is going forward is a more cohesive collaboration and mobilization of different organizations.
I'm going to turn to Lena Torijan, who has been doing yeoman's work at our Georgetown Institute on the Onward Afghan Women initiative that we have. Lena, you're monitoring the chat much more closely. Are there other questions that we should try to grapple with while we have our experts with us?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We have a question for Richard and Shaharzad, and also I think Metra John, you can also comment on this. It's regarding the UN Independent Assessment Report recommendations and the suggested roadmap. So the question is from Nina, inquiring that regarding your appeal to not engage or normalize relations with the de facto authorities until they make effective and verifiable changes to comply with human rights and international law, including by retracting the many edicts against women and girls. Do you feel that the UN Independent Assessment Report recommendations and a suggested roadmap aligns with this view?
Take it away, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Milan and Lena. I didn't go as far as saying not engage. I said not normalize.
Right.
I think engage. What I've said, and I said it earlier today to the media. Engagement to do human rights advocacy and women's rights advocacy is something that I've always advocated. In fact, what I've said to member states is if you meet the Taliban, whether it's in person or online, it's usually in person, they don't do much online, make sure that in every meeting you raise human rights and women's rights, even if the purpose of the meeting is something completely different. If the agenda before the meeting is about agriculture or about the economy, still raise human rights. And the same message to all the UN agencies who are in Afghanistan or who visit Afghanistan, same message. And make sure that every delegation you send has women, and not women as a token, but women who talk, women who are empowered to speak to the Taliban. So I'm not against engagement. I am for, and I'll say, constructive engagement involving clear and strong human rights advocacy. Now, the second part of the question was about, the question was about the roadmap. I actually think some of the elements of the roadmap which set out human rights benchmarks, and including particularly rights of women and girls, are aligned with what I would also advocate. It's any process, and I said it earlier today, any political process, be it post the recent Doha meeting, we're not quite sure how that's going to go forward yet, or any other process, needs to put upfront as a matter of central policy that human rights and the rights of women, including the rights of women and girls, will be core to those discussions, and that the first people that I would ask member states to listen to about that are Afghan women. They need to be included, and they need to be meaningfully included, and they need to be the first port of call for any member states that are engaging in that process to consult with. Thank you.
That's excellent, Richard. And I think what we've been saying is constructive engagement does not mean normalization. It does not mean recognition, but it really must have human rights at its core, and it must have the engagement of Afghan women, which you stated. Shaharzad, you've been nodding affirmatively. Did you want to add anything?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, I very much agree with Richard. I think some level of engagement has to happen. It depends on what level. It depends with what intention, what goal, and what parameters. I mean, there is engagement at the technical level to ensure delivery of humanitarian aid, to have oversight on delivery of humanitarian aid. That's essential. You know, we need that engagement to be happening so that there is humanitarian aid being delivered. There should be also ongoing efforts to resolve the economic issues. And, you know, kind of the conversation around the independence of central bank. There's been continuous pressure on Taliban. If we want continuous pressure on Taliban and on human rights, it's inevitable. You can't have pressure without people talking to each other. But it's about the parameters of that engagement and the objectives of that engagement. I think there's a lot of fear and concern that under the banner of engagement, we have normalization. We have this, you know, the whole focus is that there is this end state in which, you know, Taliban would be recognized. And we are kind of sort of trying to make our way there. And in the way, we might slowly drop one by one all the conditions for that recognition. That's what shouldn't happen. So I think that's important. There was also a question from Margaret, you know, about kind of, you know, around the same issues. You know, should they be ostracized or should be? There is a real risk if you ask for complete non-engagement, that the cost will be paid by Afghans. So I think we have to really focus our attention on what kind of engagement, what does principled engagement mean? And 2.5 years later, and after a lot of advocacy by Afghan women rights groups, human rights groups, I think it should be pretty clear. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. Principled engagement is easy, but I think it's clear. If people want to understand, if people want to know what principled engagement is, there's enough out there about what principle, you know, putting, as Richard said, putting human rights at the heart of your engagement, being very inclusive and consultative with the Afghan women's groups, but also understanding and acknowledging the fact that Taliban are not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is much more diverse. There's a whole ecosystem, including, you know, other political groups, human rights groups, civil society groups, even, you know, religious groups inside the country who don't agree with Taliban's policies, etc. All of them should be heard and consulted.
Yeah, I'm really glad we could add this element to the discussion on engagement, because I think it is an ongoing issue that continuously gets raised for obviously good reasons. And these are wonderful comments by both of you. We have time for one more question. Alina, do you have another one?
I understand that some of our panels may have to leave shortly, so I think that this will conclude the audience Q&A. But Ambassador, there's a lot of interest in regards to what can people do today in regards to supporting the campaign against gender apartheid. So I open it to our panelists to leave with ending remarks, and then back to you, Ambassador.
Any final comments to enable our wonderful audience to be able to be more constructively engaged on this? Richard, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Milan. I'm only going to say, and I mentioned it before, that it's a rather technical request. I won't say more than that at the moment. I'm preparing a report, a further report for the Human Rights Council in June on widespread and systematic discrimination against women in Afghanistan. I've put out a call for submissions, and thank you, Lena, for posting that. And so I would invite people to continue to make submissions, and I will focus my advocacy around this report, which I'll deliver to the Council in June. But second thing, I don't want this report, if possible, to remain sitting here in Geneva in the Human Rights Council. I hope that it is considered throughout the international community, including the major organs of the UN, the General Assembly and the Security Council in New York. So I would call on your help to, once this report is made, to use it in your own advocacy. Thank you.
And there are links to this report and others in the chat. So for people who want to look at them more closely. Shaharzad, any final comments?
Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful audience for their patience and the engagement. We are on the eve of 8 March. 8 March, now I'm in the UK. Here, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal. But in Afghanistan, 8 March used to be a very big deal. There are a lot of ceremonies and, celebration. So on the eve of 8 March, I just ask our audience to do something with in solidarity with Afghan women, to sing a song, read a poem, send a message of solidarity to the women of Afghanistan. Put it out there online. It may get to them, it may not get to them, but I think it's very important to tell women in Afghanistan that they are not alone on the eve of this International Day of Solidarity for Women.
Metra?
Thank you, Ambassador. So one of the things we are doing is to decrease the Taliban issue against women, the mixed majority of their decrease, and analyze it against the international law. So every inhuman act, every principle of the Charter of the United Nations and norms of international human rights are systematically being violated by the Taliban. And I think it's time that we ensure it's called for what it is. How they can help is write to their representatives, keep themselves aware of the situation in Afghanistan, contribute to the reports. And lastly, I think in solidarity with women of Afghanistan, ensure to amplify their voices. They have their voice, but they're living under a very harsh, oppressed system of a militarized terrorist group. That amplification is needed, and that solidarity is what we need at this point. And I think regression of women's rights in Afghanistan won't remain there with that group. So that's what I ask.
Thank you. And Alyssa, the last word.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for such a rich discussion. I just wanted to flag in the chat what Lena has just shared, which is a very preliminary compilation of upcoming March events around International Women's Day and Women's History Month. All of these are on gender apartheid. There are more to come. There are a couple during CSW that I know will be taking place as well. So please do just stay tuned on the End Gender Apartheid Twitter, and we'll continue to keep that updated. And otherwise, just to remind folks that April is the resumed session of the 6th Committee, so any state engagement in advance is very much welcome. And the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project, and I know all of our co-panelists here would be happy to touch base and kind of brainstorm in advance if you have any advocacy you'd like to bring on. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so very much, and for giving us so much time and sharing your expertise and experience with us. Thank you, Richard, always, and for the indefatigable work that you continue to do to Shaharzad, to Alyssa, to Metra, and also to Hannah, who had to leave us a little early, but gave us that wonderful sketch of international law and how it informs all of this. I think the audience, all of you, thank you for joining us, but you have been brought into this conversation time and again in terms of the importance, and I will say responsibility, to engage on all of this. We all need to be much more engaged, doing all that we can to really support Afghan women at this particularly difficult time, and to use the kinds of instruments that exist and hopefully new instruments to better bring justice and accountability. So thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone will continue to be very active in this space. Lena, I can't thank you enough for all that you do to help us keep going on this issue. And I think the best thing we can say is ever onward. There's so much work to do. So thanks to each and every one of you.
Thank you, Milan, and thank you to Georgetown Institute for a very rich and important discussion. And
Thank you, Richard.
all my all the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.